So, welcome to my presentation on implicit associations and decision making, or more specifically, to what extent do positive associations formed while viewing an advertisement carry into minor decision making in Spokane teenagers. You'll notice that the word minor is in italics up here, and that's because it's kind of the main point of this entire research question, and I'll get to why in just a minute here. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what led me to this question in the first place. I've always been fascinated by the diversity of thought that people have all across different cultures. Having studied Japanese language and culture for around 5 years personally, one of my favorite instances is when I see examples of culture shock. It's kind of undeniable that the culture that one grows up in and is surrounded by impacts every aspect of who they are. It was this fascination that really led me to begin looking into implicit associations and the effects that, which are the associations that you have that are not something that you're thinking about constantly. But since implicit associations by themselves was too broad of a topic for me to cover in just this one project, I was trying to think of more specific ways to target that, and so I started thinking about advertisements as kind of a way that implicit associations might come about. Advertisements are literally designed to create associations within the viewer, as they're trying to get you to do or buy a product. And while I was doing the research for this project, I found that there were a lot of sources about how the advertisements did in fact cause people to want to buy the products, but there was less research about if they caused things that were not directly correlated to the advertisement itself. So, this brings me back to my question of to what extent do the positive associations formed while doing an advertisement carry into the minor decision-making in Spokane teenagers. And this is significant because not only is it really interesting to me, but also because it is very relevant to the world today, where we are all online more than ever before and therefore exposed to more ads than ever before. It's important to understand how these might be influencing your own train of thought. So, the method that I chose to kind of analyze this question, to pursue it further, was a quantitative multiple choice survey where participants would view an advertisement and then answer multiple choice questions. Like this up here was an example of one of them, where one option is subtly correlated to the ad and the other one is uncorrelated. The goal of this would be to see how or if an ad is influencing a minor decision being made, as if they were more likely to choose the correlated option over the uncorrelated option, it might be suggesting that the ad had some sort of minor effect in that decision being made. But first I want to dive a little bit deeper into the science of how everything works in this, so implicit associations and advertisements. Implicit associations are subconscious associations connecting social groups, places, and ideas. What's happening in the mind of an individual when they create these implicit associations is the creation and deletion of a thing called synapses, which connect neurons in the brain. It's kind of like a web, as seen in that diagram over there. These synapses are responsible for pretty much everything that we do, from breathing to experiencing emotion. And they're at an all-time high of creation when people are little kids because they're experiencing everything for the first time. But as we get older, there's more and more, and the web gets more and more complex, and the associations also get more complex, and things such as bias against entire cultures can surface. One of the most common ways to measure these biases is the implicit association test created by Dr. Anthony Greenwald. This test usually displays a stimulus, like an image of a person, for example, and then maybe the words good or bad. And the person taking the test will have to choose between good or bad very quickly as a response to the image. Generally, what this test finds is that there are associations, generally negative ones, against entire groups of people that people don't realize that they have. And then advertising, this one's a little bit more straightforward because most people do know that advertisements are designed to convince you to buy a product. They're advertising the product or idea. And going back to synapses, in my own personal research, I wanted to find an advertisement that had been seen by a large variety of people, because going back to the synapses,
the more times that you see a stimulus, the more likely the synapses to form. And the more synapses are, the higher likelihood of there being an association is kind of what we're measuring in terms of the advertisement. So now going through the literature review a little bit to get a more complete understanding. This first source was called Reading the Mind of Children in Response to Food Advertising, a cross-sectional study of Malaysian school children's attitudes towards food and beverages advertising on television by Ning et al. In this source, researchers were attempting to prove a correlation between the advertisements that students watched on TV and their subsequent food preferences. They did this by surveying families in China, India, and Malaysia, and asking the families about their children's TV habits and dietary preferences. What they found was that the Malay and Indian children were more likely to, or who watched more TV than their Chinese counterparts, were more likely to, for each additional hour of TV, have a favorite ad, make a purchase request, and have product preference. This shows that the advertisements do, in fact, influence decision making. But something more also significant about this source was that students were also reported as repeating things such as jingles and catchphrases from the commercials throughout their day-to-day lives, which suggests that the ads were advertising themselves just as much as they were the product, as the jingles are not necessarily the goal of the advertisement. And then the second paper I wanted to take you through was called The Repetition Break Plot Structure Makes Effective Television Advertisements by Lowenstein et al. So this source talked about repetition break plot structure, which is where they have, it's an advertising technique where they establish a pattern, and then right towards the end of the advertisement, they break this pattern and surprise the audience. 3 studies within this paper worked to show that this is effective because it increases audience engagement and causes them to think more about the advertisement later on after viewing the ad. This is important for my personal research because, as I mentioned earlier, I want an association to be formed with the advertisement so that I can measure it with the survey afterwards. So just to recap real fast, the conclusion from the literature: food advertisements are very effective, and the repetition break plot structure is very effective. So now on to the actual creation and conduction of my experiment. The first step was to pick the advertisement. I really wanted to pick an ad that had a really high likelihood of being seen by a large variety of people, like prior to taking the survey. So I decided to look into Super Bowl commercials for 2021, as that is one of the most highly viewed television events in America. And a number of people, myself included, will watch it just because of the ad. They're a higher quality. So I found a list of about 60 of the Super Bowl commercials from 2021, and I watched all of them, and I picked out a few, there were not very many, that were food related and also had a repetition break plot structure. And I came to the conclusion that the advertisement titled Come Together, advertising M&Ms, was the most effective one for these 2 things. And then step 2 was to select the images for my survey. I needed to select a correlated image and an uncorrelated image for each question. The uncorrelated images were chosen with a random word generator, which I then took the word and just found an appropriate image to suit that word. And then the correlated images were chosen after watching the ad for the entire duration and marking down notable instances, and then condensing those instances into one word that I could find an image for. Some of them, like this one, is a little bit more obvious, such as candy is correlated to M&Ms. But some of them were things like gift and airplane, which were elements that were found within the ad. So the step 3 was to actually create the survey. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned that the implicit association test is a tried and true method. But I didn't use it because of 2 big problems with it. The first big problem was that it's very complex and it takes a very long time to take if you're not used to it. And I was worried about losing responses because people wouldn't take the entire thing, or they would do it incorrectly. And the second big problem was that,
Oh, yes, the only way that I could make an implicit association test and distribute it, I would not be able to distribute it over the internet. And because we were all in lockdown at the time I was making the survey, this did not seem like a very effective method for me to gather the results that I needed. So I instead opted to create a Microsoft Teams survey where I showed the advertisement first, and then I asked if they had seen the ad before, if they enjoyed the ad, and if they enjoyed M&Ms. And then after that, I put 10 questions using the method that I described in the previous slide. And then the step 4 was to gather participants for the survey. Because I use Microsoft Teams, I could export the link as a QR code. My CAPSTONE mentor, Ms. Gruis, was able to help me distribute this to advisory teachers for the 11th and 12th grade students in my school, which gathered me about 60 responses. And then I also reached out to peers personally on social media, asking for them to take my survey, and also to an official school social media page. The school social media page did not respond to me, so that did not happen, but with me reaching out, I was able to bump the results up to 85. And I also intended to put posters out with the link on them, but there were technical difficulties and I was not able to do this. Step 5 was to delete the incorrect responses. This was the easiest step. There were only 2. It was only responses that were under 30 seconds, because the ad itself was 30 seconds, or over 5 minutes, because that suggests that people might have put too much thought into their answers. And then step 6 was to analyze the results. So after I was all done collecting the data, I was left with a bunch of different option 1s and option 2s for every single question. And this didn't mean a lot right in this way. So what I decided to do was calculate the relative uplift and conversion rate for each question, which, for example, if there was a 125% relative uplift and conversion rate for the correlated option, it means that people would have been 125% more likely to choose that option over the other one. This was the formula used for it, and I could have done it by hand, but I decided to do it on this website to eliminate the risk of human error to a greater extent, and also just to save a little bit of time. And so finally, we're brought to the results. So table 1 here is showing just the raw data before I analyzed it, like I said in the previous slide. The percentage of people who chose the correlated options for each question. And then tables 3, 4, and 5 show the relative uplift rates for people from the entire sample, from the people who had only seen the ad before, and from people who had only seen the ad before, enjoyed the ad, and liked M&Ms. These are color coordinated, and as you can see, the significant instances are in orange, and there are a lot of significant instances. However, about half of these significant instances across these charts are in a negative direction. So like negative 70%, as you can see here. And so, what does this mean for my research question? Unfortunately, it doesn't mean very much. Because of the negative uplift value, that means that people were significantly more likely to choose the uncorrelated option as opposed to the correlated one, suggesting that there was an association at play. It just was not connected to the advertisement as I anticipated it would be. And so when thinking about what might have happened in this experiment, something that happened fairly early on was that I selected the images that I was going to use for the questions. And when I was doing this, I didn't take into account that I might be using my own implicit associations when choosing those. I didn't consider that other people's brains might not pick up on the same things that mine did as I was watching the ad the first time. So that could be something that went wrong. There also could have been a lack of association formation, just in general, as it's not guaranteed that even if they did like the ad and everything like that, that they would have an association formed. And there was also the problem of potential image quality differences, because some pictures were just better looking than others compositionally. The limitations of the survey include that there were only 83 usable responses, which is, as it kept getting narrowed down more and more, it started getting more and more small. It was smaller.
And like I said in the previous slide, the survey images were chosen by me. And there's always the possibility for human error. So thank you for watching my presentation on implicit associations and decision making. Here are my works cited.
Okay. 3 questions. Okay. What was one obstacle or challenge you encountered while performing the research, and how did you address it?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it was a really big problem at first when I figured out that I couldn't use the implicit association test created by Dr. Anthony Greenwald. Because this had been a tried and true method, and I thought it would be really useful in this experiment. However, after doing a little bit more research on the different ways that associations can form, I decided that this multiple choice option that I did was probably going to be adequate if I did it correctly.
Question. What additional questions emerged during your research? Based on your recent experience, what advice would you give to other researchers who might choose to investigate those questions?
Would you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah. What additional questions emerged during your research, and based on your recent experience, what advice would you give to other researchers who might choose to investigate those questions?
Okay. Well, a big question that I had earlier on was whether or not I should include things such as audio cues within the advertisement itself, or if I should stick to it just being visually, or which senses I should focus on. So if I were to give advice to somebody else who is going to try something similar to this, I would say to do more research into the particulars of what kinds of associations can form with different senses, and how those work a little bit more.
And then, which of your sources was the most influential, and in what way is that influence apparent in your final conclusion or result?
Well, definitely the most influential was the study that I detailed earlier about Malaysian school children and their higher likelihood of requesting certain things based on TV advertisements, because that sort of went along with both the implicit associations and the advertisements. And this was not very apparent in my final conclusion because I did not notice a correlation. However, I think that it does still tie in with the general idea of the project very well.
Thanks, Anna.